Hi guys, welcome to another episode of QQ, brought to you by Second Perspective. I'm Paul Weston.
I'm Nathan Smith, and this is going to be our spoiler talk on Predestination.
Finally, we get to talk about spoilers.
Yeah, it was actually really hard to do the non-spoiler version of this. It's really hard to talk about this movie, like anything, even who people are.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, because, one person's kind of everyone. But, yeah, so I guess let's start in this. So, yeah, this is Predestination, directed by the Spierig Brothers, with Ethan Hawke and Sarah Snook. They previously worked on Ethan Hawke and Daybreakers, and I thought that was kind of... It's been a while since I've seen it, but I thought that was a kind of an interesting but not great movie. I remember it had some really cool concepts about vampires. I don't want to dwell on that movie too much, but I did see some creative spark there. So it's good to see these guys kind of move on to something that's, frankly, pretty bold. This is a ballsy script.
Yeah, very much so. How do you want to go about this? Alright, well, the thing that I really want to talk about is about the ending, but we won't, jump right to it.
Mm-hmm.
But why don't we talk about the beginning? What did you think when you saw sort of the first scene?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, okay, I think the sci-fi elements in this are really well set up. They're pretty understated. Like, everything... it's a smaller budget movie, but I like that they make good use of effects. And the visuals, like, the way the world... It's got kind of this strange... it almost kind of reminds me of things like Battlestar Galactica. I mean, it doesn't look quite that advanced, but what I mean is, everything feels kind of mundane, like that idea of, phones with cords and weird things like that. But then they have, spaceships and time travel devices and all these weird things, and then they have, at one part they're wearing those helmets that are, over their heads, and I'm like, that feels futuristic to me, and I like that. I think it all blends really well into this world, and,
I remember when you and I were watching it, you're talking about how they had time travel and the Space Corp and all this sort of stuff in the 70s or whatever like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because everything, yeah, as you said, it sort of feels almost old or dated to us, and then yet they have these very advanced. We're talking about time travel. Although I thought how they tackled some of those things where they didn't have this huge, metallic pod for time travel, whatever. They literally had a violin case, and then they had those little numbers. They're like, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna change it, and those are the dates and all that sort of stuff. So, on a purely sort of production level and sort of a filmmaking level, I thought they were quite smart about it. Where literally they just had characters hold on to a violin case, and when someone jumped into time, either they used a fan to blow a wind, or they shook a room, or they shook the camera.
Cool kind of shockwave effect. Sometimes they'd land and you'd see chairs move back and papers go flying very subtly, but it's interesting, and you get that satisfying whoosh sound.
I think a lot of it was sound design, to be honest.
Oh yeah, I think so. And it's it's so minimalistic. It's not like Terminator, where a giant electric portal opens up that destroys the cement, and out steps Arnie smoking and smoldering. It's very understated. It's very simple, but it makes it, it just grounds it. It makes it feel real to you. And yeah, the beginning, Ethan Hawke gets his face blown off, which is...
Although you don't... you don't really recognize this Ethan Hawke until he sort of goes through his whole... travel, and watching it with Nathan, I just saw his brain working the whole time, trying to keep up and try and sort of not outsmart the film, but at least know what's happening next. And that said, the moment at the beginning where it actually confused me because I'm just slower than he is. But when someone was shooting at him, talking about hims and hers, and anyways, it's gonna be confusing. But when the guy that was dealing with the bomb gets shot at by the person in the shadows, and the person dealing with the bomb gets his face sort of all burnt and whatnot, and all of a sudden the violin case got kicked towards him, it confused me, and maybe I just missed a shot or something. But at first I thought it was the person who was shooting at him gave him the case, and so that way for me it just created even more confusion. But Nathan apparently got it right away that it's going to be Ethan Hawke, but I just thought it was that moment there, even though I was just slightly confused by it, I thought it set up a very good sort of baseline for there are going to be things that happen that you don't understand. You're just going to have to sort of hold on to them for a while, and they will, the sort of the purpose or the significance will kind of come to light later. And I thought they did a very good job of sort of setting up that understanding between sort of the filmmaker and the filmmakers, I should say, and the audience, because right after that you go straight into a bar scene that seems totally irrelevant to, I mean, like, it's not, but it feels almost irrelevant to the fizzle bomber and time travel and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Nathan and I were talking about this beforehand, but I personally enjoyed having that sort of more sci-fi time travel section beforehand, so that I tried to connect the dots and understood that this bar conversation is far more important than it seems. Because if the film started with just the bar conversation, it was well written. The dialogue was very naturalistic. The acting was good, and I was on a purely like sort of acting level as I was interested. But I don't know that I would have had as much of a sort of keen eye on sort of why is this important, or sort of a sense of intrigue. Do you want to like bring up what you were talking about? How you thought
I probably should have brought that up first before we started saying that.
that's okay. Like
yeah. I mean, well, let's just before we move on from the beginning, I think what it does is it sets up the notion that it's going to be a fairly complicated movie. Like right off the beginning, even if I did start making assumptions. I've seen a reasonable amount of time travel movies. I don't want to try and sell myself as being overly intelligent. Some of these things were just guesses. Like I'd be like, that might be him that kicked the suitcase or the violin case towards him. But, I still wouldn't understand exactly why or how that's happening. But I think what it does is it just sets up a very complicated notion that there's this time travel agent who's chasing someone that he can never catch. And there are certain elements in it that we don't yet understand about this chase. And I think that's the important thing to take from there, is that there is something going on in this chase that we don't quite understand. And then when we transition to the bar scene, it starts to unfold a little more. It's also, I really like the way the movie opened with that opening quote. I can't remember what it is exactly, but he said, "What if I could put him in front of you, the person who ruined your life, and you knew you could get away with it? Would you kill him?" And I think that's a really interesting question to put up right away, especially when you learn, far later into the movie that, virtually every single character in this movie is actually the same character. So, I mean, it's really interesting how the movie opens with that stuff, and what you're actually seeing is Ethan Hawke in his various stages of life all interacting with each other, even in this opening scene. So, yeah, we move on from here, and then we get to the bar conversation. This is when the first two actors are introduced, and we got Sarah Snook, the other actress, rather. She's introduced, and she's playing a male at this part, and she's does a really good job here, I think. I think seeing her playing both a male and female role is really fascinating. I think she does a really good job with the mannerisms. And this bar conversation, it goes on for a while. I mean, before anything sort of goes underway. But
I think you can get away with that because of sort of the first couple scenes that happened, right? At least I don't know if you can get away with that if you didn't.
Oh, I think you can. I think you definitely can.
Okay, well,
here, I just want to say, let me just say, like, what I was telling Paul, like, is I would have loved if the movie opened with the bar scene. There's something, like, really mysterious about the bar scene, because what you have is Sarah Snook enters this bar, and she's an unnamed protagonist, and we have Ethan Hawke, who we've seen in the beginning, but anyway, he's the bartender, so immediately there's this weird, jarring switch where, like, we just saw him trying to defuse a bomb, then he gets his face burned off. Well, you don't really see him until he gets his face burned off. And then we switch over and he's a bartender. And so you're like, okay, so something's going on here. And they start talking about stories, and, as a bartender, he seems to be really bad at jokes and things like that, it's pretty funny. There's a lot of humor, very well-written dialogue segments during this. And then,
And they just, like, leave seeds everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere, yeah. Just
like, haha, I'm talking to myself.
Yeah. And I really love how Sarah Snook her character sets it all up, and she says, for that bottle over there, I bet I can tell you the most interesting story you'll have ever heard. And they kind of sit down, and that's when we get into her life story, which, she doesn't even know the full extent of how interesting that is. But I really like this conversation. The thing I like about it is it begins so mundane. Like, it's just an everyday occurrence. As you get two people in a bar just talking. The bartender, you know, whenever bartenders are brought up in movies and books, they're these kind of conduits for stories. Always. Like, that's their purpose. Because they hear so much. There's so much to talk about. There's so much to listen to. And then it just escalates. It turns into this very, I don't want to say like ominous, but we suddenly start to understand that there's something going on beneath this conversation, and it starts to become more and more apparent that Ethan Hawke wants something out of Sarah Snook's character. That he is here, and he has met her not by accident, but he's here for a reason. And I think it's really interesting how that sort of just kind of, it keeps accelerating towards the point where he reveals that, you know, he's a time travel agent and all the stuff is going on. I thought this would have been a fascinating way to actually just open the movie, because there's something, I think, inherently very catchy about starting a story like that and just kind of taking it a very strange turn that audiences might not expect. But of course the problem with this is the first scene does set up some necessary information, because we return to that, so it's not just extraneous information. There's almost nothing that can be cut away from this movie. Like, it's very tight. There might be some pacing problems, you know, in some of Jane's early life stuff when she's in the orphanage.
Like in the montage.
Yeah, there's like, it does continue for a little while, but at the same time it is kind of necessary to set her character up, because her character is every character, so every single detail becomes important in shaping the way this character thinks and the motivations of what she does. So, I mean, yeah, I just thought it would have been kind of fascinating if there could have been a way to begin it with the bar conversation, because there's just such a great ambiance to this conversation, and both actors are running on all cylinders here. It was really fascinating. But yeah, it was just sort of an idea. Obviously, things would have to be changed for that to happen.
And so, like, obviously, Nathan probably should have mentioned that beforehand before I started going my little rant or whatever, but my main argument to him sort of restated is just that that first of all, I'm not sure how well the audience would be receptive to the idea of a bar conversation suddenly turning into a time travel movie, I don't know how well an audience would sort of receive that, and having that scene at the beginning basically allows that scene, I think it actually fuels the scene sort of intrigue, because you know it's not just a bar conversation that will turn into, like, you know, a romantic movie or whatever. It has something very potent about it, and you know that there are a bunch of mysteries, and that the sort of mundane or sort of seemingly normalcy of it is completely false. So it's just something I thought might be interesting, sort of just bring different views on that. Do you want to quickly just go into sort of, why don't we go into the middle of the movie in terms of like the sort of, actually, one quick question. When you saw Sarah Snook's character, did you think she was a man or a woman?
I recognized the face as being a woman, but it definitely looked, I didn't know if they were like, if she actually was a man, or if she was a woman dressed as a man. I couldn't tell. I knew the actor was a woman.
Yes.
But I didn't know where her role lied in this movie. So that was kind of interesting. It's a very androgynous-looking actor. Like, you don't really know what exactly... And, you know, even Ethan Hawke's kind of confused when she opens with that line, "When I was a little girl," and he just stops her and says, "What?"
Well, no, like, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. It's just because... Okay, the confusion that I had was, first when I saw it, I was like, okay, that's a feminine-looking Leonardo DiCaprio, like, and I thought, okay, it's a woman, and he goes, and then Ethan Hawke has a line where he basically said, "What do you want, man?" or something like that. I'm like, okay, it's a guy.
Yeah, all her lines are very masculine, like in the opening bar segment.
And so I almost wish she looked a little bit more like a man, or I don't know. For me, like, I get why it's very essential to the story that she looks the way she does. But for me as an audience member, I actually got confused and actually pulled out of the story to the point where I wasn't quite following what they were saying, because I wasn't sure what the film wanted me to think, whether it was a man or was a woman, or if it's supposed to be sort of ambiguous. And so I was sort of left in kind of a mind space where I was going like, I'm perfectly okay and happy with, it's a mystery, but I didn't know if it was supposed to be a mystery, or if I was supposed to be very clear it's a man, or if it's very clear it's a woman, and I don't think I would be the only person on that. It seems like a very minor thing, but I feel like I probably missed a little bit of that scene. I couldn't quite enjoy it as much. And like, I'm sure that Nathan and I have talked about it before, but there's a difference between ambiguous nature of something and vague or just very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it wasn't for very long. It was for probably about 4 or 5 minutes. Something was vague or confusing for me, not ambiguous. I'm like seriously like nitpicking here, but that's what we're doing here. So, anyways, I was curious about your thoughts on that. Moving on to the sort of Jane montage, I thought it was kind of interesting, sort of following her story, and I thought they did a very good job. Moment where it's like when I was a little girl, and Ethan Hawke was like, wait, what? I thought it was very clever. Like I was very clear on what they wanted on that. Like Ethan Hawke thought it was a man. And we were supposed to believe it was a man. But the problem is, like, even with that confusion I was just talking about before, I wouldn't have had the same confusion mistake as Ethan Hawke. So that moment was sort of lost on my sort of confusion beforehand. But going through the montage, when the part where it sort of basically heavily hints after she takes some of these like medical exams and so on and so forth, and it basically tries to start slapping us in the face like, hey, by the way, she's going to have some sort of birth abnormality that basically is going to make her become a man. They singled it so early in sort of not the montage, but the sort of life story that when they finally told me, I was already like, I know that she's gonna have to be turned into a man, and I felt like the moment didn't have sort of the potency that it was supposed to, just because it was like, hey, by the way, she's got something strange with her medical exams, and then they sort of hovered around it for probably a good 3 or 4 minutes, and I think it was a little longer than that. Yeah, maybe even longer. I didn't want to oversell it, but it was just sort of like, okay, I get the point. She is going to turn into a he. Just give it to me. You don't have to like.
Well, but I mean, it's not all set up for that. I mean, like there is a lot about her character that needs to be revealed to the audience to understand, because it's a very complex sort of chain of events that happens throughout this movie, and like understanding everything from her orphan stage all the way through to when she's applying to SpaceX, I think it was what it was called?
Space Corps.
Space Corps, yeah. SpaceX is a real thing. Yeah, so Space Corps, when she's applying to that and, she's doing her training there, I mean, it's all sort of, it's necessary to understand that character because it paints a very isolated and lonely person. Like a person who is always looking in. They're always on the outside looking in. They're always getting picked on. They're always, ostracized from everyone else in their life. And, in the orphanage, she's always fighting people. In Space Corps, everybody just looks down at her, and she's like a freak, Everybody's absolutely tired at this one training segment when they're running, and she's running, 3 hours later? She's just jogging, and, everybody's like, what the hell is wrong with this person? And as we find out, it's because she is, like, physically there is something different about her body. And you learn that she has actually 2 sets of sexual organs. So, I mean, it is sort of, there is some pacing problems here, I think. I think it might just hang on a few things too long. But I do think that the majority of what's in here needs to be revealed to the audience. Or at least that was my take on it.
Yeah, well, and I agree with you. It's just sort of, say, like, we have that sort of segment, or it's like A, B, C, D. I felt it was like A, B, and it just sort of like, it was the whole, it was like she fights people like 3 or 4 times, and I think I guess my whole thing was just it's sort of stated the same point twice or three times sometimes, and when you make a film like this and it's like it's about time travel and like people like making it's just having all these very complex sort of chain of events, as you said. I don't know that you need to pound. You kind of just need to trust the audience, because if you're gonna lose people, you've already lost them if they can't follow you on some of these things. So it's just I guess they fed me some points a couple times when I thought like, okay, I got it. This is not the thing that's gonna lose me. It's when like Ethan Hawke, the barkeep, goes back to like kidnap himself, and it's just that's
let's talk about some of that stuff. So I mean, like pretty much once we get the early story of Jane, and turning into John, like around that point, like the film starts to accelerate a lot. You get suddenly all these details that are very ambiguous, and you know that they're going to add up to something. So we get that she meets this mysterious lover, that you know she has sex with and gets pregnant. At which point, you know, she has a cesarean and becomes John, and then the baby gets stolen a few days later. So there's all these little things happening, and you're not quite sure where they're going. And this is when I started to get really interested in this movie. I mean, I was enjoying myself, but this is when the film finally starts to loop back to its beginning, because it starts to go back to that very time-traveling nature. Like, you can tell that there are things going on here. So right away, I mean, I had this notion. I was like, she's gonna sleep with herself. Like, I just kind of had this idea. I'm like, this is a really weird and kind of dark and twisted road to go down, and they're totally gonna drive down it, like, in a convertible.
my question was, at what point did you have that thought? And what gave it to you? I
think when I had that thought was probably about the time when, you know, when she revealed that she met this mysterious person and then she got pregnant. I don't know why, but I just immediately sort of was like, okay, she's a female in growing up, and now she's a male. She is somehow gonna get time travel and sleep with herself.
Man, and see, you go
I didn't
so
know.
much further than
I didn't know why that would happen, though. I mean, I was like, that is absolutely bizarre. But like, it's so bizarre, you'd have to do it. You'd be obliged to tell that in your story. And I think they did, and it was really, you know, it's a really twisted road to go down. I liked it, though. It was a really cool twist. Even if you see it coming, it's pretty fascinating. And the way it happens, you know, Ethan Hawke, you start to realize that he's in this bar because he wants to set something in motion, you know. He reveals himself as being a time travel agent, and then he says, you know, we go back to that line. What if I could bring that person to you who ruined your life, and you could get away with it? Would you kill him? And then, you know, he takes her back in time, only to find out that the person who ruined her life is herself.
See, that's when, before I kind of get to that point, I do want to say one thing is, like, so often, like, when we've reviewed other movies, and I can think of one right off the top of my head. It's often what we're really upset about with films is that they don't commit to something and they don't go down the road. They don't just go, this is what it should happen, or this would be the most interesting, most risky, but most interesting. And they sort of like chicken out. This is part of why I like this film so much, even though I have sort of a huge issue with sort of at the end. Not a huge issue. It's like in between normal issue and huge issue. But that's what I really commend about this movie. Going back to what Nathan just said, my sort of one kind of just thought of about sort of the consistency of the timeline. And like I can understand, like, you know, going sleeping with yourself and like biologically can you create yourself, and I was like, okay, whatever. Like I understand with some time travel movies you just kind of have to go,
we do need to talk about that. Don't gloss over that.
Okay.
We need to talk about that.
Well, we will. But like, so generally with a lot of time travel movies, and some movies in general, you just kind of have to go, this is the rule that we set up. Like they created one of those time travel rules where it's like, they can travel as far back as 52 years from year zero, which in year zero is when time travel was made. And it was just like, they didn't explain why. They said, or like, your brains get all scrambled. Okay, fine. I believe you. Yep. Like it's one of those things. But one where I started to question the character motives just a little bit, is when, okay, the barkeep sends back the unmarried mother, Sarah Snook's character, back in time to go and shoot that person, that ruined her life, and then she bumps into her younger self, and she realizes that she's the guy.
Well, he doesn't send her to shoot that person. He sends her so that she realizes that.
Oh, really? Anyways, clear. Okay. Okay. So I'm learning something new. Luckily, it doesn't change my point. Otherwise, I sound like a complete idiot. Although I probably do anyways. Okay, so let's just clarify. So she goes back.
Okay, let's lay it out.
Okay.
Let's lay this movie out a bit here. Like,
Okay.
do you want to do that?
No. We don't need to clarify that point. Like,
okay, well, make your point.
So no. It's. I thought the whole point is like, I said, like, would you shoot the person? Right? She gives him. Doesn't Ethan Hawke give her a gun?
Yes, but the whole point he's taking her back, so she realizes the person who ruined her life was herself.
Oh yeah, duh. Okay, yeah, I know that.
Yeah, he didn't send her to shoot herself.
I know. I'm
Yes.
saying, but she thinks that she has to.
Oh yeah, she
so
thinks
that's,
she has
yeah,
to, but that's
I'm
obviously
like,
not his motivation.
Yeah. I'm going from so I'm not a complete idiot. I'm just going from Sarah Snook's point of view. But anyways, when she comes back to realize that she is actually the person she's looking for, okay, that gets really confusing very quickly. Why? Anyways, my main issue with everything is, why would she go and sleep with herself if she knows, if she has all the information in her head that she knows she's going to totally screw up her younger self's life? Why would she do that? And holy crap! Okay, I think I'm starting to. Okay, now I think I sort of need to bring up the ending, in this fact.
Well, can it wait? Or does it have to?
I think there's a really interesting parallel. At least I think so.
Go ahead.
Because the whole point I brought up is that she's aware of what's going to happen. She's going to sleep with the person, or sleep with herself, her younger self, and then she's going to get pregnant, and then the child's going to leave. She's already lived that life.
Yes.
Right? Why would she do that?
John has lived that life.
John has lived that life. It's the exact same issue with the Fizzle Bomber and the Barkeep. The Barkeep knows, the Fizzle Bomber tells him if he shoots the Fizzle Bomber, he is going to end up as a Fizzle Bomber. And then so she is going, the Barkeep is going to turn into what he doesn't want to be. Right? So I just realized that there's sort of two circles on that end.
There's a lot of circles in this movie. It's like a big Venn diagram of some kind.
Yeah, and actually those are sort of my two issues. Right?
I don't know if I agree with that issue. I mean, I think they're kind of different things. I mean, the motivations behind each of those are different. I will say that the reason that I think that one of the things this movie does really well is that it sets up this character, like I said, as being a very lonely character, and the only person that's relevant in his or her life is his or herself. There's I think it's right when they go back in time, John asks Ethan Hawke's character, who we learn later is just future John, he asks, like, is it a lonely life? And you don't know how much, at that point in the movie, how much weight is behind that statement, because you find out that almost every character in this movie is the main character. 4 out of the 5 characters in this movie are the main character. It's pretty tragic, and you start to understand that, like, the only person this character loves is themselves, in different timelines. Like, I don't mean that like in an egotistical way, it's that this person has lived in such a reclusive life, ostracized from society, that the only person they can identify with is themselves. And when John goes back in time, he loves her. He loves himself, what he sees there, because he's so sad. He sees that past that he's lived, and it's tormenting, it's heartbreaking to him. And I think it goes back to that, is he just absolutely loves himself, and I think it's a very tragic sort of story, and maybe we could have used like a couple more scenes to show that transition happen, because I understand what you're getting at, but I do think that it works well for the movie.
Like
I don't think any logic is really broken there for me. I do have some issues with what's to come, though.
Yeah, I guess my whole thing was just sort of the character motivations, and and that's where it starts to get a little bit more confusing, because then that's, in those particular scenes, especially where, like, John decides to sleep with Jane, like, you end up making very clear choices of what the character wants, because throughout the entire film, you think, the Barkeep is trying to stop the Fizzle Bomber, and John wants to basically, wants to get revenge on the person that ruined his life, right? And they're both given that opportunity to essentially achieve what they truly want, quote unquote, or is what the film sets us up to believe, right? And both of them have the opportunity to. John gets to stop Jane's pain that she's going to go through, right? Like, because if he doesn't sleep with her, the pain doesn't happen. I mean, like, I'm not sure if he gets alive, and it starts totally screwing up the timeline, but ignoring that, like, going on purely on character motivations.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
He gets the opportunity to not make her have just the most miserable life ever, right? And then at the end, the barkeep also has the opportunity to stop the fizzle bomber in a weird sense. Like,
I want to stop you on that one because there is something going on there that you're glossing over, and it's the fact that in order to believe that, Ethan Hawke would have to believe the fizzle bomber.
Yeah,
which I know is him, but still, that means you're trusting the words of your enemy.
Yeah, that's why it gets a little more confusing. Like that's a thought in my mind, and like I sort of like, okay, he probably, anyways, like I'm aware that's one of the caveats to that one, but it's
different for John because he's lived the future that Jane is going to live by doing this.
Very true.
But Ethan Hawke has not lived as the fizzle bomber yet,
which makes it kind of interesting.
Yes, it does, and I know what you mean. Like if he shot himself, he would not become the fizzle bomber.
Yeah.
Because the fizzle bomber would be dead. But still, it's like he's been hunting this person for what we can guess would be eternity. Like we have no idea how long this loop has been going on. So I mean, to believe the words of the fizzle bomber saying, "If you kill me, you'll just become the fizzle bomber," you probably wouldn't believe that person. That would be like Batman listening to the Joker and agreeing to what he has to say. Like it's really hard to bring yourself to do that.
But see, I don't know if that's necessarily true because the barkeep. So okay, just so we're all okay. Jane is the female version. Or like when she's a female, John is when he's just turned into a man. The barkeep is Ethan Hawke. Fizzle bomber is. So we're just all very clear on the 4 different ones. The barkeep has been doing this for a very long time.
Yes.
And I feel
technically they've all been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, right. But like in a linear fashion. Right?
Yes.
And we go through so much of the film to show that the barkeep is an intelligent man who is aware of sort of the power of time travel and all the loops that both John and Jane have to go through and all this sort of stuff. But for him just to go right to the laundromat and just sort of go no and shoot him, it seems very rash and very. I guess it's like it's the moment where the character suddenly becomes stupid. For me, anyways, like where it's like because. The thing that I love the most is where, like, any kind of shows, what have you, films, whatever, where the character is at least as or smarter than me. Like, one of the reasons I loved Breaking Bad is because whenever I saw Walter White, he always did things that I was like, holy shit, that's so smart. Or I would never have thought of that. Or he totally outsmarted me, the viewer. Because it's usually, these days, very rare that the character is smarter than the viewer, right? And it just, in that moment, it just felt like the barkeep was smarter than me through the whole film, and he kept his head. He said he never broke the rules and all that sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden, at the moment when it mattered absolutely most, the writer made him less smart than me because, like, knowing that there's at least a possibility or a potential truth that the fizzle bomber is telling the truth because he's like right in front of us. He's got headlines. It was just. I felt like they could have. I
don't agree with this. I don't.
Well, and that's good, right? Like, and I think that's great, right?
Yeah, we're having a conversation,
right? I
don't agree that he did something unintelligent, though. I don't like that word because I don't think he did something unintelligent. I think he did something very human.
I said rash, and if I said unintelligent, I mean to it. But I know I didn't mean the word rash, and it's just So it's just with that character, I just thought they could. And like I'm absolutely perfectly happy with the barkeep doing something, as you said, very human. But it felt like it happened like that. Like he literally, out of the blue, pulls out the gun and says no and shoots him. Like the
conversation goes for a bit. I mean, it's not like he walks in and shoots him immediately.
Yeah, but they do have a short conversation, but I felt like there's a moment or two, or maybe three or four, that were missing that could have really, because he says like, I'm not going to turn into a Fizzle Bomber. Fizzle Bomber says something. I'm not going to turn into a Fizzle Bomber. Brings up another fact. Like, the Fizzle Bomber felt like he had a fairly interesting argument anyways, and I felt like, I guess I just wanted something that made the barkeep truly believe he was not going to be the Fizzle Bomber. Like, something new, or quote-unquote what he thought was new or different from this potential loop.
Well, I mean, the thing is like, as much as this character understands time, it's a very human thing to want to destroy the monster, you know? It's like, it's the good versus evil argument, and obviously that argument gets played with very much here because good and evil and everything is all just one character in this movie. But
Which
it's
is very
like,
cool.
It's very cool. But when you look at it from Ethan Hawke's perspective, is like, he flat out refuses. He said, "I will never become you." Like, he is standing behind that. And unfortunately, we know the truth is that he very much will become this character. But I mean, the Fizzle Bomber himself also has motivation for what he's doing, because he says that he's killing these people to save more people in the future. So it's basically like, he is still this temporal agent just acting on his own. He's like, the only way he's able to save people is by killing a lesser few. So he's doing the whole, like, the lesser evil is the better way to go type approach. So I mean, we don't know how Ethan Hawke's character, the barkeeper, gets to that point. We're not privy to that information. Just
which would be an interesting film on its own. But anyways,
basically, for somehow between, you know, whatever age he is at that point when he's the Fizzle Bomber in that laundromat, he somehow has changed. Whether it's the time travel kind of warping his mind a bit, or you know, what have you. But I do think it's a very human action that he does, because he's trying to get rid of the monster. He's trying to kill it within himself and say, "I will never become you." And the tragic act is played out. You know, it's a fallacy within the character, but I don't think it's a fallacy within the writing. I do have a problem with some of the ending.
Like,
I don't want to hang on this for too long.
Yeah. No, I just the one thing is that he brings up so much evidence that that's going to be the truth. I just have such a hard time that Ethan Hawke's character couldn't find something better than just to shoot him. Right, like, anyways, it's just, because, like, he brings out the whole Alice, like, he's gonna be a wife,
yeah.
Has headlines, but like,
remember, we are viewing this from the perspective of a guy who has just chased this person for, again, like, how long? I don't know, like, so long, eternity, we don't really know, and he's chased this person and found out it's him. His view of what's right and wrong is very distorted at this point. So, I mean, you gotta take that into consideration. It's not, he's not acting very logical here.
I guess, like, my last point is basically, it's just, like, I feel like the moment almost works, but doesn't quite. And it's just, I think the argument's too heavily favored in Fizzle Bombers, where it's just, I don't feel like there's any, like, I don't have any hope that he's not going to turn into a Fizzle Bomber, or at least that he believes he's not going to turn into a Fizzle Bomber, when there's so much evidence that he's going to. When there's, like, I just wish there was, like, one moment where I was like, well, you know what, maybe this time he's not going to. Which I actually might lead into.
That would be interesting. Yeah, and that kind of does bring us to one of the points, one of the flaws I sort of did see with this movie. I think you felt it too. There's two things I kind of want to bring up. But we'll talk about this one since it's in the same vein. But yeah, basically, like, the big reveal, the big thing that this movie is working up to, like, from the very beginning, from that very first moment, and even in the birth, you know, in the process of him taking the child that becomes Jane, which eventually turns into John, which goes back in time to sleep with Jane, and then John becomes Ethan Hawke, and then becomes a Fizzle Bomber. Through that complex narrative, the big thing about it is learning that Ethan Hawke becomes the Fizzle Bomber. That's the big moment that they want to hit you with. I don't know if that's the right moment. I mean, it's a very interesting moment, and you definitely want that to be, like, a twist. It's one of those things where, like, you can kind of guess it. I don't know if that's terribly important, though, because, like, this movie has two primary characters. They're, like, that you know of from the beginning in the bar. There's Ethan Hawke and there's Sarah Snook. So you know, like, one of them is going to be the Fizzle Bomber. Like, it's just that simple. Finding a why is a much more complex narrative. But the thing is it's a very interesting twist, but I feel like the movie, that the filmmakers didn't capitalize on what it means. So we have this very lonely character who is everything he loves and everything he hates all at once. Which is, like, very tragic, I think. I think that is a very sad story. But I feel like when this movie ends, the greater significance of that isn't taken into account. Like, what does that mean thematically? Like, where does that leave his character? Like, what you just said of, like, maybe there is hope that this one time things might be different. I think that would be a fascinating way to end it. I mean, that would be...
That's what I thought. Okay, like, that's what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? And that's my biggest issue with this film, is that the biggest reveal is, I don't know if it's that, Ethan Hawke is the Fizzle Bomber so much as that this loop will continue forever. Right? And I think that's sort of... I think at least that's my sort of interpretation of it, is when they give us that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious by the end of this movie that it's going to happen again. Like, and endlessly. It's a loop.
And, like, that's... The unfortunate part is, like... Okay, if you want that to be sort of the reveal, then I need something more thematically, like...
Yeah, and I can agree with this. I can agree with that. Is like, I feel like these events play out, but then you're kind of left in a very hollow state where you're like, okay... I'm glad to learn that the Fizzle Bomber's him, and now he's killed himself, and now he's going to become the Fizzle Bomber. But, like, I feel like if there was, like, another scene after that, maybe where we start to learn that his perspective on what the Fizzle Bomber was doing was changing, or just something, something post that, you might get a very interesting look at this character. And I think the script is very smart, but then it kind of drops away thematically and doesn't really linchpin itself to a real, like, emotional moment there. It kind of just leaves you hanging on all these facts that are there.
It feels like it's like, look at me, I can do a backflip. And it's like, that's great that you can do a backflip, and it's a beautiful looking backflip. But it's just, like, what is the meaning of that backflip? No, it's just like, it's, because there's so many really interesting emotional aspects to this film. It's like, because this person, couldn't find somebody to love, or couldn't open up or something, they became what they didn't want to be, or because they were so, like, it's just like they couldn't, like, I don't need them to, like, 2x4 me or something.
Yeah.
But it became from first a very interesting and a very emotional story to basically a, like, narrative spectacle. And then I think that's the right way of saying it, of just like, look how well that we have put all these things together, that each and every moment in the script works, and it all fits into this, like, puzzle. But it's just it sacrificed sort of the spirit of the film, or the possible spirit, I should say, to be this, just, it's very mechanical now. It's not...
Yeah, and in a way that's a good thing. Like, the mechanical nature of it is, I think, very interesting. But I also think, I think where it loses the chance to become something, like, I think it's a great movie, but it could have been a masterpiece. And I think where it faltered slightly is it just didn't have the thematic ties by the end. It didn't wrap itself all the ideas of this lonely person and the concept of doing this through eternity, this loop, and that this person is everything good and bad in their own life. Because they are everything in their own life. I mean, there's some really profound concepts here, and I just don't think they're quite tackled by the end in the way they could be. So that's a bit unfortunate. I do think that's probably the biggest flaw of the movie. The other one I want to bring up, and this is the final one, this is a little controversial. Like, I don't think you had much of a problem with this, but I do think it's something that needs to be discussed, because it is one of those things where it's like, I feel like the filmmakers are getting away with it. So, hang on. I want to bring this up. So, I feel like they're getting away with it. And that is, and if anybody watches this movie, and hopefully I'm understanding things correctly. Hopefully we are. And it's that, so the barkeeper is sending John back in time to sleep with Jane, which then produces Jane. That is very confusing from a storytelling perspective, but it also doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And the reason that doesn't make sense is, so, like, basically, like, so Jane has a child, which Ethan Hawke then later takes, as we learn. He steals that baby and brings it back in time, which you learn is the orphan that becomes Jane. And I think the complicated thing there that makes no sense to me is that I don't understand how an offspring is the same character as the person that gave birth to it. And I understand that, the embryo was fertilized with the exact same set of DNA because it is the same person. John and Jane are one and the same, but it still doesn't produce the same person. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. And
I don't know biologically if that's
I mean,
like,
biologically, it's not even possible. You can't, like, we're talking about, theoretical stuff here, but I don't think that makes any sense. And I do think that this is one aspect of the script where they're kind of just getting away with it. They're like, you either, and I accept it because I like the movie, so at some point you just have to ask yourself, how much are you going to let this bother you? But it's like, I do think it's one of those things to note, because I feel like this is a little bit of a logical flaw within the movie, but they're just kind of, at some point you just got to be like, okay, let's move on. So, I mean, I do want to bring it up because I think it's worth talking about. I know you weren't as bothered by it.
Yeah, no, it's, I like, you're basically saying what I'm going to say to you. It's like, if this is the one sort of, like, pretty sketchy foothold that I have to kind of stand on to make this story work, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought about this film a lot, and it's sort of, it was very entertaining. It was a good movie. I will deal with it. Like, it's
absolutely.
And a big part of the reason why I will just sort of go, okay, this is just something I'm just gonna have to suspend my disbelief for. It's like, is there any other way that they could have probably solved this issue?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, this is what happens in the short story. I didn't know this movie was based on a short story when we first watched it, but when we looked it up, this is the short story. It's about a person who goes back in time, fertilizes themselves, has a child that is themselves. So, I mean, it's like, it is about that.
Yeah.
And so I guess, like, from the writer's perspective of this movie, no, there is no other way if you want to adapt that short story. I think the problem, though, with it is that it happens at a moment, like, the reveal of that happens at a moment where all the pieces are starting to come into play, and it's a little cumbersome to suddenly be like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. How do you produce yourself? And I think that question is not a question you want the audience asking, because you need them to keep up with the rest of the movie. So I think that was the problem, is because I physically remember I stopped the movie at that point. I actually hit the pause button, and I said, wait, what the hell is going on here? And it was because of that. I said, like, I thought something was missing. I'm like, but if the orphan that is produced by Jane becomes Jane, that doesn't make any sense, because that's not Jane, that's her child. But if that is what the movie wants you to believe. So I think it might be placement of that. And again, maybe there is no better way to do it. Maybe that's just the script. But
I think my main reason that I'm sort of okay with it is I just don't think, like, I think they executed as best they could and sort of minimized the confusion by it. As best they could. Like, I understand there's going to be a whole bunch of issues, because as soon as you start really thinking about it, like, okay, so the very first iteration of Jane, where did she come from? Because she probably didn't come from herself. And as soon as you start going down that road, you're just going to, like...
But I feel like that's less of a logical loophole. I mean, like, questions like that are, they are, like, legitimate, like, how the hell would this have all started? But I think you can come up with some interesting answers yourself that do make some sense. Like, I know we theorize that it's possible Robertson, Ethan Hawke's boss, he's the sort of, I think he's the director of this time travel cop agency, that, there are a lot of hints throughout the movie that he very well knows Ethan Hawke is the Fizzle Bomber, or becomes the Fizzle Bomber, rather. And that these events are in motion for a reason. You're not really given much of an answer as to why, and I'm fine with that. I think it's very interesting that it's done that way. But you can assume that maybe he's the one who set it all in motion. Maybe he started this loop to create the Fizzle Bomber for the agency, for him to be there for a reason. Maybe they need an enemy. Maybe they need to change morale or funding or whatever, And so I think that's less of a logical loophole, especially because the movie doesn't even exist at those times.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if we're on the same page, and maybe we are. But I meant, like, if John sleeps with Jane and creates the baby that is the orphan, right?
Which is Jane.
That restarts the loop every time.
Yes.
Right? Okay. But in order for the loop to start in the first place, Jane needs to start from something other than herself.
Well,
right?
Jane was just the original Jane, which I'm assuming eventually turned into John.
Okay, but where did and this I'm just gonna go down this road just a little bit, just to sort of show, like, once you start thinking about it too much, it just gets all over the place. But let's see if we get anywhere. The original Jane, before time travel.
I know, stuff,
yeah. Where do you think, like, where could she have come from?
Well, my assumption is that she was born around. I mean, she obviously was not born in the time when she was the orphan, because she was taken back in time for that point. But, I mean, it's really hard to say when, because she could have been born at any point in time.
Okay, not who's when then, but like from who, like who would have been her original parents?
Oh, who even knows? I mean,
like that's what I mean, right? And it's also like, okay, did she originally have parents, or was she like legitimately the very first iteration, like just a sperm and an egg?
She
and
must
like,
have had parents. I would assume.
Right. So then, okay, well, then where did her parents come from? And that's when it just starts to get like totally confusing, and it just sort of I go, okay, in order to enjoy this film and sort of appreciate its narrative mastery, I kind of have to accept. I have to kind of like, okay, put a wall between like the beginning of the loop and sort of the end of the loop,
absolutely,
and just ignore everything on the outside.
The point I wanted to make though is that the logical flaw I had of John and Jane producing Jane again is within that loop. It's not that is within the storytelling. Like all the other stuff, like you said, they don't matter.
What's the main issue that you have? Is that it's just logically the audience. It just doesn't make sense. Like,
it doesn't. I don't think that makes sense. I think it's very confusing. I think that does not make sense. But like I said, I think even worse more is it comes at a time when you're trying to make sense of other things in the script. So when that's thrown in, at least for me, I ended up getting stuck on that. I was just hung up on like, how did John and Jane produce Jane? Yeah. Like I was just hung up on that, and all these other elements of the film are going in. So I'm crashing like, I need to actually start paying attention to this other stuff. But in my mind, I keep going, I must have missed something. Like John and Jane can't produce Jane.
So. And there probably isn't an answer to this, but like, what do you think could have been done to make it, to sort of mitigate those problems? Like, can you think of anything? Because I can't.
If you're going to stick with the original short story script, which is which would entail John and Jane to produce Jane, I just think maybe revealing that at a moment when nothing else is going on that I need to pay attention to. Like, reveal that at a specific moment when, then it's very hard in this movie because there's always something going on.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, we've complimented on it.
I think it just needs to be isolated. Like, I think
its very own moment.
Yes, I think like the director, like, because it happens at a time like, and again, I sort of anticipated that Ethan Hawke was going to be the person that steals the baby, which becomes Jane, and he takes it back in time, but it happens at a time when he's sitting outside the hospital, and then Robertson comes in and they start talking about the fizzle bomber and all these things, and that's what I mean. So there's other things sort of happening at play, and I feel like in order for me to sit with this just for 5 minutes, it needs to just be given its own moment where I can just come to terms with it, because ultimately you have to. If you're going to enjoy this movie, it's a sort of aspect of it that you have to be like, whatever, it happened. But I just think it's at a moment when it's not at its most efficient.
I think I understand what you're saying, and I see the merits of that, but I think the filmmakers actually did the complete opposite on purpose. On the idea that because it's like
you always like to look for the upside in things, don't you?
Yeah, well, I need to balance one of us out. So as soon as you, especially with time travel and all this sort of stuff, the moment that you leave something open and you start trying to explain stuff, you leave the opportunity that people will begin to ask more and more questions.
I don't think they'd be explaining it, though, by what I'm saying. It'd be the same moment. I
can sort of agree with that, but on the same token, I can see why they did this, where they basically said, by the way, John and Jane made a baby, same baby, great, okay, not asking questions, great, let's go on to something else. And I know that you don't necessarily agree with it, and I can see why you wouldn't, but I'm saying, with them saying, okay, let's slow down, audience, just so you're aware, John and Jane, they made a baby, it happens to be Jane, I know that makes weird sense, and it's not totally it doesn't totally make sense, but we want you to be okay with it, okay? So this is how it's happened. Alright, is everyone cool with it? Okay, great. If you do that, I think it leaves the audience longer to think about it and just realize just how messed up it is. I think that's what the issue is.
I think you're left with it anyway. That's the problem.
See, I didn't... It was only when you paused and you're like, Paul, what the hell? And I was like, what? And you're like, they made themselves. And I was like, yeah, I kind of was just okay with it. But that doesn't make sense. And then all of a sudden I started thinking about it, right? So, it
is a problematic moment one way or another. It's something that I think is a little bit of an anomaly in this script. It's
Hopefully,
one element
yeah.
where in a script that's so tight, I think it is a little loose. It's like that one loose screw that's like, it might hold the machine together. We'll find out.
Turn it on.
Yeah.
Hopefully, when you watch the film, it's not a big. Or when you watch the film, because I hope to God you watched it and you didn't just learn from us this way, because this is a terrible way of learning it. But when you watch the film, hopefully you didn't you didn't bump into that loose screw. We'll call it. And I don't know. I think this is sort of a good discussion to have, because these are the sort of the decisions that like writers and directors have to have. It's like, okay, what do we think is the best way of doing it? Do we give them some time to think about this and hopefully sit with it and just kind of go, okay, this is great, or do we go like give them, this is what we're doing, and then moving on and sort of explain other parts? Like, is that the best way to handle? Because I know that I guarantee you that they need to realize this is probably the weakest, or not. It's not weakest, but it's just the most. I think confusing.
It's weak as a word. In a chain that's fairly tight, it is the weak link, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we'll call it the weak link, but just the most potentially confusing aspect of it. These are the decisions and questions that like filmmakers make, and it's really interesting sort of seeing the merits, and honestly sometimes it just comes down to the filmmaker's or writer's decision or thought, because I mean, like, there's no like right or wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And like Nathan and I would both direct it differently on this, obviously. So it's just, I don't know. This is the really cool part. So like, if you ever come across a moment in your film, you're like, well, this could have been this way. Well, often the two best choices for one of the weaker links is often two very divergent choices, and it's usually like and it's so. If a director or something does a decision in a film that you really disagree with, it might just be the other decision or the other choice that you don't necessarily agree with, but it's the second best if you're in that sort of group. So, just something I think about in films in general. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. I kind of want to watch it again, but I don't. But yeah, no, I do.
Well, yeah, I think at some point I'll watch it again, and I think if you guys notice anything that we've got terribly wrong, please let us know, because I'm sure we could have, for sure. Yeah. It's definitely a mouthful for a movie. It's in a good way though, but it is a very confusing movie.
Yeah, I will bring up sort of one last sort of thing, just about in films in general, because Nathan and I have been talking about it throughout films in general in the last little while, and I'm not spoiling anything from Inherent Vice, but with Inherent Vice, the big thing that people sort of disagree on is whether it's coherent enough. And there's a whole bunch of different things going on, and whether that's artistic choice, and whether that should be allowed, or if it's the right choice, and all these different things. And I think the thing that the film does really well, and I think where personally I think Inherent Vice failed, and where a lot of films that are not as coherent fail, is that yes, it's movies about time travel, and then there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of confusing aspects to it. But as a whole, I understood what the story was about. I understood from moment to moment what it was attempting to do, and what story it wanted to tell me. There are a lot of parts where I at least understood at least half of what was going on in each moment, and I think that's really important, so that I didn't get lost in the story, and I didn't just, when I was watching, I go, I don't understand the emotional relevance of these moments. Even if you're like, okay, I don't know if being able to have sex with yourself to create yourself is biologically possible, or if logically correct or whatever in the story. We understood that's what happened, and we could emotionally resonate with each moment that was going on in the film. And that's with a movie like Inherent Vice. When I was watching it, I couldn't even enjoy the acting, because I didn't know what the emotional stakes and the importance of the scenes were, because I didn't know what each character meant to each other, and what it meant to win or lose each of these moments. And so what Predestination does with a very complex story is that it allows us to maintain a connection to it emotionally and be entertained with it, even if we are sort of lost on certain parts. We are always at least have one strong hand on it, and it can follow the emotional heartbeat, and whereas a lot of films that are like, oh, it's just, it's art house, or it's it's just you need to watch it a second time. We could still be entertained by it. We didn't get lost and just had no idea what was going on, and thereby stopped caring. Because like at the end of the day, we have to always care when watching the film, because otherwise the audience is not going to care. It's not going to they're not going to watch it, and there's no point for them to watch it. Especially when there's so many films to watch, so many video games to play, so many books to read. If we don't understand, if we don't care the first time around, unless they're especially dedicated, or it's Paul Thomas Anderson, you're not gonna watch it a second time. So I don't know. I thought that was something to kind of. Do you have anything to sort of bring up on that discussion?
I mean, yeah, I agree. I think the movie does a great job of making sure that for every step it takes ahead of you, it's making sure to leave you like a breadcrumb trail, so that you understand. Like, even if you don't understand the greater significance of the movements of the story, you still understand moment to moment sort of what's happening, like what these people want. And usually if you don't, it reveals it shortly after. Like the scene where Ethan Hawke takes the baby. You don't even realize at first that he's in the hospital hallway. He's just standing in a hallway.
Which is very clever.
Yeah, it was very well filmed. And then he, the door opens from, that we previously saw. The nurse exits the room and he walks in. And you've seen this shot before. And you're like, oh, he's the one that takes the baby. I mean, like, you might have already guessed that at that point. But either way, it's revealed in a way that, at that point, it's not ambiguous anymore. Yeah. The movie's firmly telling you this is what happened. So in case you were slightly confused before, here you go.
Yeah, and like, you still may be confused as to why, but you at least know the what, and what is like Ethan Hawke is taking the baby. So, and the film does that very good with images and shots and that sort of stuff. And it might also be like, I don't want to ever say that Paul Thomas Anderson doesn't know what he's doing with the camera. So I'm not going to say Inherent Vice had that issue, but this film does a very good job of sort of keeping you up to date visually as well, even if the lines or sort of the emotional moments are a little bit confusing. They leave very good visual clues. So, anyways, I think we've talked long enough about time travel. I again thoroughly enjoyed it. I give it an A-, though talking more about it just makes me realize it is a very good film. And I will definitely watch it again. I recommend you guys watch it. I'm sure Nathan says the same.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I give it an A- as well. It's a very good movie. It's very bold. Like, it goes into a lot of places you wouldn't see movies try. It's some daring material, just because it does risk losing the audience, but I don't think it ever does. It keeps up with its storytelling, and it commits to its final moment.
Yeah, I will always rank a movie that takes risks higher than something very safe. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right, this is Paul Weston signing off. Nathan Smith.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you find logical flaws, please let us know in the comments, or email us and tell us how much you hate us because we got it all wrong and they're not the same person. Or
if God, if they're not actually the same person, that would be terrible. Or if you have any movie recommendations that are something similar like this or what have you.
Not 50 Shades of Grey.
Well, I didn't necessarily mean 50 Shades of Grey, but a film like this, or any film in fact, let us know. Anyways, take care, guys. I thought that was a good one.
Yeah. Would have been cool to get